Hello and welcome back to the channel. For anybody paying attention to UK news these days, well, the UK seems to be in a little bit of an economic pickle. Things are going somewhat crazy, Liz Truss has resigned, the economy is down in the toilet, and people are trying to figure out what to do. Right now, the news seems to be saying that the Conservative answer to this is to replace the second worst Prime Minister that the UK has ever had with the first worst, the worst Prime Minister the UK has ever had, in the form of Boris Johnson. Because, of course, nothing solves economic chaos quite like bringing a man renowned for causing chaos. But I digress. So back a little bit to perhaps might be the exam question for this video, which is, what should the country do? What should the policies be pursued to solve its economic problems? And my thesis here really is that actually for the UK to solve its economic problems, it first needs to solve its democratic problems. So with that in mind, I thought I'd do a not too serious but a more light-hearted video where I invite people to join me perhaps in a bit of a mental ramble and some ideas, some things that can be pursued in the goal of improving democracy. Like I said, no need to take this too seriously. But I hope there'll be some good ideas that, of course, will be applicable to UK politics, but might also be applicable to people in other countries looking for ideas. So let's start with the obvious one first, which is electoral reform. Because whenever anyone talks about democratic reform, most people think about electoral reform, which is, of course, in itself quite important, but it isn't the whole story. But I will come on to that in a bit. So at the moment, there's lots of talk about whether proportional representation is a system that should be campaigned for. This is a live discussion in the Labour Party, for example. Of course, it is not in the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party has no desire to undermine its ability to influence elections. But and especially for the smaller parties like the Greens and Lib Dems and even Reform UK, they are all very much in favour of electoral reform, because they all know that the current system massively disadvantages small party, and that is in many ways deliberate. So back to proportional representation, and the truth is there's many different versions of proportional representation, and there's pros and cons that can be argued for each version. There's also a variety of other versions that other countries use, whether that might be alternative vote, single transferable vote, and so on and so forth. But the point I wish to make here in the discussion about democratic reform is that there are certain key factors that people need to bear in mind. The first one I want to highlight is that the UK is unique. There are not many other countries that follow the UK model, in that you don't get to vote who forms the executive branch. And this is one of the things that you can really detect quite a lot of fusion from various voters in the UK. For example, those that keep saying they voted for Boris Johnson and he had their mandate. Well, actually, the truth is, no, you didn't. Whenever a voter casts a vote in the UK, they do not cast a vote for the Prime Minister. They get one vote in the UK system and one vote only. That vote is for their MP. Now, their MP may or may not make the party leader the Prime Minister, but also that MP constitutionally has the power to unmake that party leader the Prime Minister. And of course, we've seen lots of recent examples of this. So when you look at that sort of system, you also understand that in terms of democracy on a scale, the UK system is pretty close to the bottom. Pick any other system, whether European, whether American, and so on and so forth, and they are all far more democratic than the UK. And this is because their electorates get more than one vote. So let's take the US system as a classic example. Their electorate can vote for a congressperson, or they can, in a separate vote, they can vote for a senator, or in a separate vote, they can vote for the president, or in a separate vote, they can vote for the governor. I think you get the theme here. In the UK, by contrast, you just get the one. That is it. So when it comes to any discussion about electoral reform, whether it's PR or any other system, then the big elephant in the room that people need to address is this structural issue in British politics. Because it's very hard to have proper electoral reform if you're going to maintain a current system which is basically a little bit of an elected dictatorship in some ways. The Prime Minister, constitutionally speaking, has far more power than any other Prime Minister or President in most other countries. Because of the fact that as long as they can control their party, they can essentially do anything they want when it comes to legislation and what the government does. So that is the inherent issue with the UK system. So this needs to be addressed. You need to think about electoral reform in the context of what it is people are voting for. And PR does turn this on its head a little bit, because the whole idea is that any political party would get a direct proportion of the electorate that voted for it, rather than the current first past the post system, which just doesn't matter what the proportions are, it's whoever gets the most votes wins that particular constituency. But of course there are wider questions, and I would argue that many of the UK's issues that could be addressed, for example, one is that there needs to be a separate election for whoever is going to be the executive branch, whether that be a Prime Minister and so on. There's also an argument for a more federal or regional based electoral system, and we already have that in the UK in terms of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. But of course there is a live debate as to whether that should be expanded further to England itself becomes a constituency, and maybe even then you create more sub-regional type constituencies. So these are all things that could be explored in this electoral reform debate. But the next key factor that I also want to raise is that the current UK system is a very old democracy, and it was created specifically with the purpose of giving as much power as possible to those at the top. And those at the top, of course, were the king, the monarchies, then the powerful, rich aristocracy, and so on and so forth. Ordinary citizens were not really meant to participate in British democracy, as when it first started. And we still have remnants of that system in how it works today. Specifically, what we can see is that the system is very much geared towards creating a bit of a musical chairs between two big parties, and no one else can really get a look in. And those two big parties have the incumbency advantage. They have the money, they have the numbers, they have the profile, they have the tribalism. So I would argue that any electoral reform that wants to be meaningful also will want to break up this two-party dominance. And this is part of the reason why you will never get electoral reform in the UK. This is because the Conservatives or Labour will not want to give up power, will not want to weaken their ability to dominate politics for any given period of time in which they have won, that mandate. So this is why it is very hard to secure electoral change, even though there are clear structural democratic deficits that needs to be fixed. So hence I always point out that this issue also needs to be discussed if you want to have a meaningful system that succeeds the current first past the post system. And so the final point I want to make as part of the electoral reform discussion is that whatever the system that people get results that people want to implement, many parties find themselves stuck in a bit of a rut where they're trying to fight for a political idea that not everybody can necessarily agree upon, whether that be PR, STV, any variants of first past the post, whatever. So my argument here is that rather than trying to campaign on a specific system, any political party that genuinely wants to create electoral reform not only has to talk about the structural or the structure of the whole system and how it works, but also needs to go for an approach of giving people more accountable representation. So I know what people are going to say to my next suggestion. That means referendums. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh no, UK is terrible at referendum. It's always the idiots at voting, and it always goes wrong. They're always bad and acrimonious. And yes, that is true. But that's part of the fallacy of the whole argument. Because the answer to poor or malfunctioning democracy is not less democracy. The answer has to be more, better democracy. And so here I am arguing, rather than arguing for a specific version of PR, I'm saying what political parties need to do is first secure a mandate to change the whole system, and then, let's say referendum number 1, and then to have the mandate to which system to change to. Now this can be a bit complicated and cumbersome, but I would argue this is essential. It is essential because if you're going to make such a significant change to the UK's political landscape, you must secure democratic legitimacy for that change. And this has always been a problem with the UK system. They've never really gone for democratic legitimacy beyond we are promoting this one system amongst all the other policies, and that's all the choice you get. I think they need to offer the electorate a genuine choice between different democratic systems, one of which of course will inevitably be at least PR, and that the case has to be argued for and against each system, and that by process of elimination, maybe through several referendums, whatever it takes, the eventual winner will be the system that has the absolute most support and thus the strongest democratic legitimacy. And that is the crucial point I want to end with in terms of electoral reform. And so now I turn to the second most talked about topic when talking about democratic reform in the UK, and that is about the second chamber, the House of Lords. Now this has been problematic for many reasons, and I think it's worth highlighting those reasons before we talk about my idea for change. The first thing is one of the big fears in the UK political system is that by having a fully elected second chamber, you create a whole host of problems for the political system. And a really simple example of that can be seen in the US. If you have two chambers that have in many ways very similar remit and a very similar constituency and electoral base, then you can create a political system of perpetual conflict. And this is the fear in the UK, the UK political establishment. They do not want to create a House of Lords that will constantly just be fighting against the House of Commons for no good reason than different political parties are dominating that particular chamber. So they don't want to duplicate the way the House of Commons works, and I think there's quite a good argument for that, for those reasons. So that's something that has to be borne in mind. The second thing worth mentioning is one of the unique strengths of the House of Lords is the fact that many of the peers that sit in there are usually expert in a particular topic, but also don't have to operate to very partisan lines. I'll come on to a bit more on that in a bit. But the point of making it traditionally, the House of Lords was full of old people who really knew their stuff and who really scrutinised government legislation. So when we look back over the years as to some of the worst excesses of government, the policies that were likely to do the most harm to the UK electorate, The only reason why those policies were not implemented was because the House of Lords blocked them. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, any Prime Minister effectively has a bit of a dictatorship in the House of Commons as long as they fully control the party. And of course, the downfall of Liz Truss has shown what happens when you can't control the party. But the House of Lords is that backup, that sort of the most undemocratic part of the system that actually works the best, in a way, because of what they do in terms of their scrutiny role. However, this is not as strong as it used to be. And this is because over the years, and particularly in recent years, Prime Ministers in particular have been stuffing the House of Lords with their political cronies. So jokingly be referred to as the retirement home for ex-politicians or no-hopers. So any reform of the House of Lords is basically a direct threat to those individuals. They would lose the cushy, very light workload job that they have been given, and very few Prime Ministers will support it because it removes the power of patronage from them. However, I do think there's a strong case for reforming the House of Lords. I just think that people will need to have a slightly different approach to it. So in terms of my idea, many people think of democracy as a geographical type, or voting as a geographical thing. You create a whole bunch of constituencies based on geography, and everyone living within those particular constituencies gets a vote. You don't have to do that. So there's a clear case here that you can have the House of Commons based upon that system, but the House of Lords you can base on a completely different system. And I'm calling this sectoral-based electing. So what that means is you can have a few small numbers of regions. So for example, you can have a Lord for Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland and one for England as well, for example. But the rest of the Lords will be composed by specific interest. So for example, you might have a Lord for the unions. You might have one Lord for each of the major religions. You might have a Lord for industry, a Lord for labour rights, and so on and so forth. There's a whole variety of sectors that you could give representation to. And the argument I'm making here is that you tell those sectors to create a democratic system by which they can elect their representative. So the unions are an easy example. We'll use them first. They're very used to it. So all the unions in the whole country can hold an electoral process by which they choose a Lord to represent all of them in that second chamber. And that is the specific role of that Lord. The argument I'm making here is by having a system like that, instead of electing politicians, those sectors will want to elect proper professionals who understand their industry, their sectors, their religions, whatever it may be, and will do a good a job as representing them as possible in that second chamber. That then means you now have a second chamber that is full of very experienced experts who will scrutinise government legislation, and you can change the whole tone of that chamber to being its remit is to help government do its job better rather than just to be there to be obstructive. So by having that sectoral system, you reduce the political power of the parties. Because of course, if you're a union member, yes, they may be more affiliated with Labour, but for them it would be far more important that a strong advocate rather than a political advocate is the one that's in there. The final point I perhaps would add to this is the concept of over-representation. So let's imagine you are an individual sitting in a constituency. You can vote for your normal MP in the normal way. You can vote for a Lord to represent your regional area. If you're a union member, you can also vote for a Lord. Perhaps you can vote for a Lord to represent you if you're an ethnic minority as well. Perhaps you can vote for a Lord that represents your religious belief. The whole point is, on whatever issue that any individual feels strongly about, they have a representative on that particular issue. That is a representative they can contact in order to make their views heard, to advocate a particular case, and so on. And I would argue that the current system has swung too much one way. Everyone is, or many people, are massively underrepresented. So by having a sectoral-based second chamber, that completely reverses it. And no matter what issue, where someone is based, what their affiliations are, whether they're of ethnic minority, whether they're of poor working class backgrounds, they have a group of people that they can turn to, who they know are there to specifically address their interests. And I think this would be a unique and better way of constructing a second chamber, rather than turning it into a sort of geographical based Senate, as you so often see in many other countries. Now, turning to the issue of party political funding, this is a rather toxic and thorny issue, and regular viewers of this channel will know that I consider the current political system to be absolutely corrupt beyond repair. There is no genuine defence for how parties are funded in the current system. It has been abused beyond the point of no return. So for me, party political funding absolutely has to be very high in the agenda in any conversation about democratic reform. This is a toxic problem that cannot be allowed to carry on, and unfortunately, with the Conservatives in charge, they are the beneficiaries, very much the beneficiaries of this system, which is why they refuse to change it, which is why there are so many scandals, which is why there is so low voter trust in the government, because they are seen as bent and corrupt. And this system, for me, has to be addressed. So, and this would be part of any conversation about democratic reform. So, and this is important not only in the context because the current system is corrupt, but also because it creates the incumbency advantage. So the smaller political parties can never attract large political donors. They don't, if they can't influence policy enough, then they can't attract the funding, they don't have the ability to expand. So the funding model, as it stands, favours those most likely to win. It doesn't favour those who perhaps have really good ideas, really good organisation and so on, and want to campaign on them. So they are starved of funding, essentially. And this is by design. This is deliberately perpetuated by the two big parties because the current model favours them so much more than it favours the smaller parties, and they like to maintain that. So I think that needs to be broken. And of course, let's then turn to the very difficult conversation of how do you break it? Because political parties do need money to be able to function. They need to pay for marketing, they need to pay for offices and all that sort of thing. So if they're not paid for solely by private donation, then there's an element of public funding. That means taxpayer funding. And many people automatically don't like the idea, but if you want to eliminate the influence of big money in party politics, I'm afraid you're going to have to consider party funding. So my argument here is that there's a specific cap that any individual can make to any political party. And you see this over in the US. I think it used to be $1,000. I'm not sure what it is now. But no individual was allowed to pay a political party in the US more than a certain amount of money per year. And I think there's a good argument for doing a similar system in the UK. So, for example, Labour would like that because a lot of their funding comes from union memberships and so on. So that could be maintained, and of course that doesn't stop any party from having direct membership and being funded that way, and also receiving ad hoc donations. But what this does do is stop really ultra wealthy individuals from essentially buying out democracy and buying political parties. They're buying influence. This is difficult. There are a whole host of loopholes that no doubt people will try to exploit, but I think this is at least a good starting point. Where my idea then goes in terms of how to fund them, because the problem that people will bump into is you don't want to be funding political parties on the basis of how many seats they hold, because all you're doing then is perpetuating the incumbency advantage. The more seats they have, the more money they have. The more money they have, the more they can throw at winning the next election to get even more seats. The argument I've got here is that there's perhaps a two birds with one stone approach. And the concept is that you have funding rounds. So every single seat or constituency in the UK on a regular basis can bid for money. So let's say, for the sake of argument, as an example, every single constituency in the UK every 2 years can bid for £1 million worth of funding. And that money will be evaluated and can be bid for by the political parties. And what they would do, they would link it to a specific project in that constituency. So let's say, silly example, that a particular constituency really wants a new playground for children. So the political parties could identify that need, bid for the funding to pay for a contractor to come and build that playground for that constituency, thus delivering public benefit. And as part of that bid, they would be allowed to secure an admin fee against it. So let's say that's something like 10 or 20% of the value. And what that means is that the political parties will then have to campaign on local issues, will have to secure funding to implement, those local campaigns, and can then use that funding to help support their admin and office costs. So that way, although they're receiving public funding, they're receiving it in a way that is beneficial to each constituency. What I would also further suggest, part of that proposal, is that each bid is weighted. So, for example, if two political parties and some other action groups or charities that are not political parties, say, for example, band together to support a bid, then that weight strengthens that bid. So let's, for example, imagine a scenario where the Lib Dems and Greens campaign for a new green initiative. Because the two of them are campaigning together on that particular issue, and if they get the local council that strongly in support, local communities, local charities and so on, again strongly in support, all of that would strengthen the bid, making it more likely to win. So my argument here is not only are you securing money that does good in the constituencies, but it also encourages a political system of collaboration. It forces them to work together in order to do good things, rather than destructively to work against each other for political gain. So that way, although party politics would be funded from the public purse, it would be funded in a way that I hope would be secured legitimacy, as well as lots of benefits to the constituencies operating within it. So this is my particular idea for, it's a little bit different, but I think if you're going to explore public funding for political parties, and we must in the current climate, then ideas like that people can get behind are going to be crucial in order to break this particular problem, because this has been going on for far too long now. In recent days, it has been very striking that in the UK, people are not willing to accept the status quo that the Conservative Party can decide when there is the next general election. Now, whilst of course that is constitutionally and legally the position, I think it's becoming quite clear through polling that the electorate is not satisfied with that. The electorate is of the opinion the Conservative Party have made a right mess of it, and that the people should have a vote on what happens next, who gets to form the next government. So I think those who are proponents of democratic reform can take heart from that. think that makes it clear that this is a very good time to make the case that there needs to be reform. And the case gets stronger every year anyway, and I think in the current climate it had gotten even stronger. And unfortunately, indefensible as the status quo perhaps is, there's a whole array of entrenched interest against it. So, of course, the Conservative Party itself, who form the government, even the Labour Party, many of them are happy with the current system. Especially if they're beneficiaries, if they're in charge, they actually win. The newspaper's editors don't want to. Those who make big political donations don't want to change the system either. Because they are all beneficiaries of what it looks like. But I think it has to be recognised that this position is unsustainable. And I would argue that it needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, of course, to do that, you basically need to fight some very powerful people. You need to destroy the power of the party, you destroy the powers of the media, and so on, to influence politics in the way that they currently do. So those ideas, I hope, are helpful, are interesting, and I think we should recognise that there is a mood for change, but it certainly won't be easy. And so in support of that, I invite you to come and join the murders, because any democratic reform is definitely going to require basically murdering the political parties and murdering their ability to influence events. And I look forward to seeing what other suggestions that people might make in the comments below.